Okay, we're live in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Herbst. I am the director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We are glad you joined us today. This is the first virtual panel discussion which Eurasia Center is going to be launching, is handling. We have 3 experts today to talk with us about what's going on in Ukraine. We have Adrian Karatnycky, who's a senior fellow. We have Melinda Haring, who's the deputy director of the Eurasia Center. And we have Åslund, who is a sage at the council. Now, we will start by asking Melinda about what happened on March 4 with the sacking of the prime minister and other ministers in Kyiv. Melinda, over to you.
Thank you, John. It's great to be with all of you. So this has been a big month for Ukraine. 10 ministers, including the prime minister, were sacked on March 4th, and it's hard to use a word without being overly dramatic. It was a bloodbath. Basically, anyone with any reform-minded credentials was sacked or quit. And it's really hard to say anything positive about the new cabinet. I will say one positive thing. I'm encouraged that Dmitry Kuleba remains in the cabinet, and he's now the Minister of Foreign Affairs. But honestly, to step back from the bigger picture, the more I study the new cabinet and learn more about the ministers, the less I sleep. I'm deeply worried about the direction that Zelinsky is taking the country in.
Okay, Melinda, that's certainly provocative. Adrian, your view on this?
I think from the very beginning, we were trying to, with the emergence of a non-traditional candidate with no traditional relationships with the West, with no traditional relationships with the policy community, we had no idea which way Zelensky would go. The initial signals he sent, where he combined a kind of a mixed group of people with reform credentials who had been at odds with the Poroshenko regime, seemed to suggest that he was moving in a more, I would say, consistent liberal politics direction. But this change of government suggests, and the perturbances and the turmoil that has emerged inside the faction of his parliamentary faction, suggests that it was not a base, that the personnel choices were not made on the basis of deep political convictions. And the troubling thing as we approach Zelensky in the Corona crisis era that we should be mindful of is that his inner circle, the people that he really trusts, are basically people who are from the entertainment world, from without policy experience. The very closed inner circle is basically his associates who were not engaged in politics before, and he has not made the kind of deeper set of relationships with seasoned experts that could be additional sources of information for him. And I think that's a big challenge as we go forward.
Adrian, I think that's a very interesting point. You're essentially saying we tried to fit Zelinsky into our template of reformer, non-reformer, and you're saying he has a different frame of reference.
I think he has no consistent frame of reference, and therefore, you know, what is needed is a deep engagement. You know, the IMF has traditionally been the vehicle by which reluctant policy change has been forced on the Ukrainian elite. And perhaps the IMF becomes even more important now as Ukraine will need a lifeline. But there is no internal kind of policy coherence. The initial Poroshenko policy coherence came from a lot of wise Western and Central European reformers and a former American, functionary, Natalie Oresko, who brought in the experience and the expertise of the West. The inner circle of Zelensky has none of those interfaces, and he's now facing a world in which there is less communication with him. And so it'll be a big challenge how he makes decisions.
Okay. You mentioned an important institution, the IMF. Anders, do you think that the question of the IMF loan and IMF conditionality had anything to do with the changes we saw in Kyiv on March 4?
To some extent, I think that on March 4, the government still felt that they were in a wonderful situation. They had Eurobond yields of 4%, full access to the international financial market. After March 4th, that closed up. So the president and his people thought that they could borrow as they wanted. And now Ukraine is completely closed out from international financial markets. the long yield is up to 12%, which essentially means that the market is closed. So now Ukraine has no choice but to get an IMF agreement on the prior condition, or they will be in a serious financial crisis. And this was not at all necessary. So what happened on the 4th of March, I was in Kyiv and watched this on television, was that President Zelensky made two speeches, and he said that the government was useless. The only positive thing he could say about it was that it was honest, but it sounded as if honesty was no longer important. And he had no substantial criticism against the government, small things as if they had not get enough of customs revenues when this was essentially a matter of a different exchange rate. And then he presented the new government, and he did not really say what they were good for. There was no scrutiny of the new candidates. The prime minister was a complete mystery. The minister of finance, Igor Omansky, has been there twice before as first deputy minister of finance and acting minister of finance. When he was acting minister of finance, the budget deficit was 6% of GDP. So he has not left a good memory with the IMF. Ironically, by ignoring the IMF, President Zelensky has made his government a complete prisoner of the IMF.
Can I jump in there, John, too? There's some other people in the new cabinet that I'm worried about beyond Umansky. The new prime minister has laughably little experience. He's only been a governor of Ivano-Frankivsk for 8 months. And servant of the people, I was on a show with them last week, and they were claiming that the new government is super experienced and they brought in Ukraine's finest. That claim is just completely unsubstantiated. I'm also worried about the Veterans Ministry. They brought in a man to run the Veterans Ministry who has a tense relationship with the NGOs that have been providing support to guys and gals fighting in the Donbass for years. I don't know why they chose that. And just to zoom out, there's only one woman in the entire cabinet, which is insulting and obnoxious because Ukraine has a number, thousands of top women who are primed for executive roles. And then finally this week, they named a new prosecutor general. And this person is a loyalist, and she's never been a prosecutor. There's a lot of reasons to worry about her. And I'm even more worried about the prosecutor general post because last year, the Rada increased the powers of the office. So that's one area that I'm watching closely as well.
I had a chance to meet with the prosecutor general before she became the prosecutor general. Frankly, she made a good impression on me. And while I understand your concerns, Melinda, I think that we might want to give her a chance to see what she can do. But let me ask a different question, Melinda, for you. To understand where we are today, and this follows up on Adrian's, I think, profound insight regarding where the Zelinsky team is coming from. Do you think that there was a serious effort at reform before the changes earlier this month?
Absolutely. So I was really impressed, and I think a lot of us were impressed with the momentum that we saw in the first 6 months of Zelensky's administration. Now, he had a mono majority in parliament, and he could push. I think they went too fast, and they pushed a lot of bills that were not high quality. But they did. I spent a lot of time in Kyiv interviewing businessmen, lawyers, and everyone who's involved in this. And they did a lot of very small, unsexy things that made the business climate better. However, they failed on judicial reform. They passed another bogus bill, and they thought that we would close our eyes and praise them for it. And the bill doesn't work. Everyone I know in Kyiv is dissatisfied. FDI is flat. So yes, they did some good things, but they didn't do the most important thing.
Okay, fair point. Adrian, yes, please.
Yeah. I think that we should look back at the motives for Zelensky's reshuffle. They were not based on, key policy indicators. They were based on the decline in ratings. This is an administration which, from the very beginning, we were told, is extremely sensitive from day to day on the state of their popularity. And when Zelensky's popularity began to decline, not as steeply as that of the governments. He pushed the panic button, and I think he threw out the baby with the bathwater. And then he was faced with the challenge, as some of the ministers in solidarity or unwilling to work in the current environment did not accept the offer of a reconfiguration. He was forced into a complete overhaul of the government with not very impressive results.
John, let me add there also that there has been a major problem with government coordination. And the point is that Alexei Honcharuk was appointed prime minister because he was considered weak. There were many candidates, and he was perceived as the weakest of the possible candidates, and that he proved to be. So the whole idea was that the president's office rules, and that the cabinet ministers don't really talk together, but carry out orders from above. And you can't run the government like that. And the whole thing was kept going thanks to former chief of staff Andrei Bogdan, who was considered obnoxious, who was a steamroller. But because he was a steamroller, he could make the government make the right decisions, and also the parliament. Without him, there was no real connection between the president's office and the ministers and the cabinet of the ministers. And the whole thing seemed to come to a halt. But that was for a rather short period. And then it seems that President Zelensky got upset, less popularity and not getting things done, and that the cabinet didn't work together. But it had not been allowed to work together. So the problem lies in the president's office rather than in the cabinet of ministers. And this was outside observers see, which is why the market, the international financial operators have become so disappointed.
John, let me make one more point with your permission.
Please.
To underscore Melinda's point about the prime minister, if we are looking for a person who handles complex institutions and complex patterns, a person who runs a local power plant is not the way to go. A local power plant is kind of like the national bank. You kind of regulate it. It doesn't have a lot of employees. You keep the cash flow going. You maintain the books. It's not a very complicated business to run, and it's not even a labor-intensive business to run. So the idea that this guy had a lot of administrative or business experience goes down the tubes. You know, he doesn't have private sector, nor does he have public sector. And so I don't think that there was it's clear that Honcharuk was extremely weak, but it's also not so clear that his replacement has the kinds of qualities, especially in this moment of looming emerging crises and global recession.
John, can I piggyback on Anders and Adrian for one short point?
Please.
Thanks. I think that Anders is spot on with his observations about Andrei Bogdan in the presidential administration. I wrote a column and I was very critical of him, but now I kind of miss him because he knew how to whip the rata. He knew how to get things done. He knew how to move paper. And he also cared about domestic reform. So from that vantage point, I'm worried about Ukraine for the next 4 years because the current head of the presidential administration doesn't seem to have those same qualities. He has other qualities. He's extremely charming. He's good with people. He's charismatic. He really cares about the war, but he doesn't seem to have the same sort of legislative qualities that Bogdan did. The other piggyback point I wanted to make on Anders was, yes, actually, this is Adrian's point. We need to study who Zelinsky trusts and who he listens to. In addition to the circle of entertainment people, we know that his wife is very important. Elena Zelenskaya is very important. The president listens to her. He talks about her, and she has good instincts. If you look at any of the interviews she's given, both for the BBC Ukraine service and the Daily Beast, she has great instincts. She knows press freedom. She knows what's happening with activists. So I'm hoping that she'll take a bigger role in the weeks and days to come.
Can I make a point about presidential intrusiveness. Really, in this crisis, the president is important to deal with the crisis points and perhaps with external policy. But really, there should be some kind of a mechanism where the parliament emerges as a much more independent force. Mr. Razumkov, who was not also a key member of the inner team, even though he worked for a long time on the president's campaign, should be reinforced. He seems to be a competent person. There are some intelligent people heading up the key committees, even though the whole parliamentary group is pretty weak. And we also see some differentiation. While there are oligarch groups that are organizing, there is now an effort to create both a democratic platform, and as we know, there was a resistance to the conciliatory, if not capitulationist decisions that were made in Minsk, and a group of initially 64 down to 57 deputies emerged as a clear voice against the kind of deep concession. So we are seeing some cohesiveness emerging in parliament, but it is being wrongly interpreted by the president. The president's inner circle have taken to referring to people as Sorosites, meaning the people who have Western experience and support a liberal reformist agenda, or Poroshenko bots, Porokhobote. And I think that those are the people who are resisting him on the concessionary policy to Russia. I think that he, in ways of communicating with him, I think he has to be made to understand that they represent not particular narrow political or funding interests. They represent fairly broad segments of both policy opinion and public opinion.
John, if I may, let me draw Adrian's point a bit further, that the servant of the people at present is really three different party factions. 30 MPs who are the Kolomoisky party that was formed already, I would say, in November. And then now about 60 MPs who are the Democratic platform. And then you have the rest post 254 minus 90, that is the Zelensky party. So he is in a minority. And what we saw in particular in the appointment of a new prosecutor, or sacking of the Prosecutor General Ruslan Raboshabko on the 5th of March, it was that 36 members of opposition platform, that is the pro-Russians, voted with Zelensky, and also two minor oligarchic factions of the people from one-man constituencies. So this is a completely different formation in parliament than before. So it has moved from being liberal and pro-Western to being pro-Eastern and oligarchic. All
right. Let me follow up on a point that both Adrian and Anders have brought up. Zelinsky ran for president as someone who was going to unify the country by focusing on the most important issues, corruption and the war. What Adrian described in terms of the way the inner circle thinks about the rest of the political spectrum, and what Anders just described is what's happening within the servant of the people party, is fragmentation. I suspect that, I mean, I only met Zelinsky once. Of course, I've studied him carefully, given his important position. I sense that he still sees himself as a potential unifier. So my question is this. Is he able to understand that his desire to be president of all of Ukraine requires an ability to bring along these different groupings? To return to his initial message of addressing the key issues of corruption and the war.
Can I?
Please.
So I think from the appointment of the prosecutor general, or the removal of the prosecutor general, it suggests that he is looking for a quick win. And the quick win is to start a criminal case and to move to the imprisonment of former President Poroshenko. I think this is more a case of bread and circuses in the absence of bread. So it's just circuses in the end. And I think and that will create further cleavages inside society. So I think that Zelensky, if he wants to unify the people when the people cannot really participate and we can't feel the political temperature of the people, has to create a government and a policy of national unity. And that means reaching out to the democratic opposition at the very least, and finding some kind of kind of lowering the political temperature for the short term, rather than seeking a very activist, attack on the former people in power. It seems to me that will create further anger and cleavages. So I would argue that the government, he should look for a formula as the crisis. One point, and Anders can correct me, in 2008-9, when the US recession was at 4.2%, Ukraine's economy declined 15%. We have figures that suggest in the next quarter the US economy will drop 14%, which it never did in the 2008-2009 period, and that means that overall the 12-month figures will probably be far greater than 4.2% decline. Although it's very hard to project, given how we are addressing the spread of the coronavirus. But it seems to me that if Ukraine is looking at 25% economic decline, the president has to look for some kind of he's gotten over the idea that you can't work with Yanukovych era politicians, but he hasn't gotten over the idea that you can't, and this is a moral stance or a psychological stance, but pragmatically, there are people from the Yatsenyuk government, there are people of some experience from even if you have an animus towards Poroshenko himself, there are people in that previous government who were just absolutely disqualified, who have some credibility, knowledge, and they should be brought in some kind of a capacity at this point.
Okay, thank you. Anders, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, 2 points. The first, what Zelensky really thinks now. Part of the shock on the 4th of March was that he looked absolutely depressed. He sat alone in a box in Parliament, and I was afraid that he would start crying. So he did not exude any confidence or trust at all. One could see this is a man who's out of his depth, who has no idea what to do. That was his own appearance, and that is quite shocking to see from any politician. And on the other point that Adrian made, I would actually argue that the Ukrainian economy is less vulnerable, because Ukraine, to a considerable extent, it's steel and grain. The iron ore export is going perfectly. So China has picked up its demand of iron ore from Ukraine. Many other places are inhibited now to produce and transport iron ore. Ukraine is not, and this is a big part of Ukraine's export. So I think that the Ukrainian economy, being much less of a service economy than the US economy, this time around might be able, simply for physical reasons and structural reasons, to be less hurt than last time around, when indeed the Ukrainian economy declined by 15% in 2009.
Melinda, I'd like to give you a chance to jump in here too, if you want, on this question of Zelensky trying to unify the country.
I think I have a slightly different perspective than Adrian and Anders. I see sort of the first period of Zelensky, the first 6 to 7 months, as one focused on domestic reform. And then with the sacking of Han Sharuk and also the change in the leadership at Bankova from Bogdan to Yermak, to me, this says that the next 4 years are going to be focused on foreign policy. That's how I read it.
Okay,
the issue is that right now Ukraine faces an economic and a healthcare agenda and crisis. And it seems to me that for its resilience, it should not undertake very domestically divisive issues that cleave the country in a way that resembles the East-West cleavage, and that is on the way to approach Russia, whether to be conciliatory and to make concessions and not to address issues of surrender of sovereignty, but just to get it done, versus defending very strongly the prerogatives of the state and the independence of the state from Russian influence. And Zelensky, if he pursues this path, he will add that deeper political cleavage to the challenge of dealing with the economic difficulties and the healthcare crisis. And one point on healthcare, just to make a positive point on the Zelensky administration, that the early response to the corona crisis and the virus has been pretty vigorous. Ukraine lacks the healthcare infrastructure to be able, Kyiv has 5% of the respirators, the ventilators that New York City has, for example. Of course, population differences, but probably 1 for every 6 or 1 for every 7, and Ukraine far less. So stopping that curve in Ukraine and making it flatter even than the Western economies is essential. And I think they've done a pretty credible job. They're going to make adjustments, but I think he has found his role, and it seems to me that that is the proper presidential role. And on other issues, he should not be looking for cleavages. He should be looking to consolidate and to deal with these two crises, and not allow a third crisis of foreign policy to develop, or internal division to develop.
There's one point I feel compelled to raise, Adrian. Something you said in your last intervention, that you're afraid that the new prosecutor general is going to go after Poroshenko.
No, I said that the president wants her to go for Poroshenko, and that's why he appointed her. I'm not so sure. I've had 2 interactions with her, and I'm not sure that she is just a, quote, tool that will do, she's not Yezhov, I don't believe.
It would be a disaster for her were she to do that. If you look at the records of previous prosecutors general, Rubishop, you might say, is the only one who's left the office in the last 10 years with his reputation intact. And so she can add herself to a list of those who have not. And for Zelinsky, it would be a disaster. So I truly hope he does not go that road. Melinda.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, if you dig in and look at her record, I wrote a column on her this week that I'd encourage everyone to look at on the Ukraine Alert blog. Her record at the SBI, where she's been the acting head, is not a positive one. The people that she's appointed have really dodgy reputations. So I think your optimism is nice, John, but not accurate.
Watchful is my position, not optimistic nor pessimistic. Anders.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to this circle around Zelensky. There are essentially 3 people who seem to have immediate access to Zelensky today. It's Andrei Yermak as chief of staff, Sergei Shefir as a general advisor and entertainment person, and then it's Ivan Bakanov, who's proven very ineffective as chairman of security services from the same group. These 3 people hang together. None of them has any economic understanding whatsoever, nor does Zelensky. And I saw the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance now. They are saying all the right things, but the question is how much do they understand? The basis of their argument is we have to get the IMF agreement as fast as possible, and we are going to do what it takes. That is a law on banking that makes it impossible for Kalamorsky to get Privatbank that the IMF demands, and the other is any kind of land market reform. So they are always saying that we will be done with this within 2 weeks. And this remains to be seen if that will happen. But there's no real economic thinker in the government. And previously you could say that the Minister of Economy, Milovanov, was the most of an economic thinker in the government, that he was not really a standout reformer as one would like to see, very much because the government was so disparate. The National Bank leadership is still in place, but they don't provide leadership. And the Minister of Finance was more bookkeeping entity that made sure to keep a budget in order than pursuing any real reform plan. So we don't have any reform conceptualization or the conceptualization of any economic policy today.
One full agreement with Anders, but one demurral, and that is in our interactions with Mr. Bakanov. I think we were very impressed at his very sober reporting and understanding of what Russia is doing inside the LNR and DNR, and his view of his threat assessments. And if he is conveying those to the president, I think we can have high confidence that there is at least not a smiley-faced, happy-faced communication channel that is suggesting that Russia is moving in a benevolent direction for a resolution of the conflict in the East.
Yeah, I agree with Adrian. Bakanov's presentation of the Russian danger was impressive.
But his SVU reform is not impressive. We need to say that.
Fair point. Fair point. Okay. Let's talk about the IMF. Anders, you mentioned that again, you don't see people with great reform-minded understanding of the economy in the Zelinsky team. But as Adrian mentioned, IMF conditionality has been an important mover of reform in Ukraine ever since the Revolution. So how do you think this will play out in the months to come?
Yeah, essentially 4 points. First, national bank leadership cannot be changed or undermined, as the government has intended to do, nor NABO, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, cannot be seriously undermined. That would be two absolute no's for the IMF, where the Zelensky group have clearly had those intention, and they have to adopt some kind of law that blocks the privatization of the Privatbank to Igor Kolomoisky and Gennady Bagalyubov, and also some kind of land market reform. These are the four absolute conditions. Then I think that the IMF is likely to provide much more money to Ukraine. So what had been discussed is $5.5 billion for 3 years. That is $2 billion a year effectively. Now I think that we should look for something like $10 billion, perhaps even more over 3 years, and with a heavy front loading, because Ukraine all of a sudden ended up in a financial crisis while the situation looked perfectly safe 2 weeks ago.
If they're going to get the deal with the IMF, as you mentioned, the banking and the land reform deals are critical. There are other issues too, where if they move in directions they say they'd like to move, it could complicate getting a deal with the IMF. For example, if they would dismiss the supervisory boards for state companies. The supervisory board for Naftahaz recently reappointed Andriy Kobolyev as the head of Naftahaz for another 4 years. Do you think that the Zelinsky government could get rid of the supervisory board and make a deal with the IMF?
I think that would be another absolute no from the IMF, but it's particularly the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, that is protecting the supervisory board of the big state company. There are now 12 such boards, but it's also typical that in his 17-minute speech criticizing the government in the parliament on the 4th of March, President Zelensky complained that there was a majority of foreigners on the supervisory boards of the big state companies, which was very much the idea in order to block corruption in the state companies. So this is the design that EBRD, together with the previous government, that is Volodymyr Groysman's government, constructed with the support of young CEOs in these various state companies. I should of course say that I'm on the board of on the supervisory board of a state railroad, so we are seeing all these discussions. And it's also harmful that President Zelensky has pushed hard for lower salaries for the ministers and also for the state CEOs. And this is seriously undermining the fight against corruption. So the Minister of Finance, for example, today earns about $1,500 a month, and that is not corruption-proof salary.
John, can I make a broader point? Because what we're discussing is presumably how we help Ukraine move in a consistent liberal and reform direction, liberal in the broader sense of the meaning. And what I would say is that one, we have to find ways that our Western leaders in this time of crisis also have time to have direct contact virtually with the president and his inner circle. We have to ensure that our colleague think tanks, major think tanks that deal with Ukraine in other places, do what we are trying to do, which is to engage the leadership team in a dialogue and discussion to keep the lines of communication going when we don't no longer have this direct second track, travel and diplomacy. Third, I think we need to work and establish relationships and encourage the reform groups and the sort of the pro-Western and the tough on Russia groups that are emerging inside the servant of the people. Fifth, I think we have to not neglect Mr. Razumkov as part of this outreach and diplomacy. Ukraine is, after all, a parliamentary presidential republic, and especially at a time of crisis, it's extremely important that not all power shift to the very narrow executive, both because we have some doubts about its competence, but also because it has longer term implications for the liberal project and separation of powers in Ukraine, if you will. So that would be my kind of addition to and the IMF is probably the wedge, and the IFEs, because Ukraine is very sensitive and will need their infusions, is the wedge through which this has to be done. But that also means that people like Steve Biegun and others have to be engaged with the IMF to let them understand that we've got a very big agenda with Ukraine to keep it on both the democratic course and on the reform path.
Melinda, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I agree with Adrian. I think it's really important to be engaging with servant of the people deputies. There are good people within the party who are reform-minded. And if anyone from USAID or DFID or any of the development organizations is listening, please continue to work with them and do outreach. They're very inexperienced in general. I would also be looking at HOLOs and working with them and trying to elevate their voices as well. And then also don't neglect civil society. Ukrainian civil society is extremely powerful. And it knows how to make its voice known. So I don't think there's a huge number of levers right now trying to bring out the better angels. Anders doesn't think it's possible. We've had an argument about this, but there are ways to continue to encourage Ukraine to make the right choices in this period.
And I would also say that this extends to the other opposition. We have a populist inclined political leader in Yulia Tymoshenko, and I think interaction on responsible behavior at a time of crisis. And I think even with potentially the pressure on President Poroshenko, I think his party should be encouraged, if the president and his team are willing, to kind of work and understand that this is a critical moment where consolidation and coordination should be at the top of the priority list. However, if the president does move in the direction of a deal with Russia that is viewed by a large portion of society as controversial, it will create cleavages. And again, I would argue that he should be discouraged from a very aggressive and assertive effort to resolve that problem in the moment where we're facing this economic and healthcare crisis.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I want to turn to audience questions. Is the COVID-19 crisis an opportunity for Zelinsky to demonstrate leadership? And Adrian already said that Zelinsky was out quick and fast on this, which is a plus. So I turned over to the panel.
Well, I would argue that the Ukrainian government has managed this amazingly well. They have essentially closed down the country. They have so far 26 cases. Of course, there is not much testing, as is the case everywhere, including here. But and there are 3 dead. But they follow this extremely closely, where they find the cases, and they have really closed down the country almost as much as California. I think from today that they have stopped transportation between regions and personnel transportation. For several days now already, we have closed all collective transportation of passengers by bus, train, airplane, and even by the metro. So this is very far-reaching, and according to my view, this is the best advice that we know so far. One can also say in general that the former Soviet countries have managed this quite well. And these Europeans, they have closed down everything. They still know how to do that. And I would comment also on what Adrian said about the hospital care. Because Ukraine has not rationalized their health care, they have about 4 times as many hospital beds per population as we have here in the US. The US has 2 hospital beds per 1,000 people. Ukraine has still 8 hospital beds per 1,000 people. And for these infectious diseases, you need many hospital beds that you normally don't need for modern healthcare. So by chance, Ukraine is better off. But of course, as Adrian said, they have little equipment of all kinds.
Just to underscore the statistics, obviously there is very little testing in Ukraine, but unlike in Moscow, where there seems to have been reporting of a big spike in pneumonias, I looked at the Ukrainian press and at least at the regional level, and there's no report of a spike in pneumonia that is outside the sort of the normal parameters of the influenza season and the waning of the influenza season. So, so far, the measures that have been taken seem to hold, and that buys a bit more time for the system to build out. But again, hospital beds, we really know what that is. It's just basically a room in a hospital, ill-equipped and so on. There, Ukraine has a very big shortage of ventilators, a very big shortage of, it will have a very big shortage of antiviral drugs. But again, by the time they get to this, there will already be better protocols. And so that they've pushed forward the curve, that gives them also the experience to examine what other countries are doing to collect resources. And I think in this case, again, you should get good marks at the initial stages to the Zelensky team. Okay.
We have a lot of questions. I'm trying to go down the list in order, but that's not doing this so quickly. We have a question, and excuse me if I mispronounce the name, from Michael Hitzak regarding Ukroboronprom, and how are things going there?
Well, I can respond to that. It's my good friend Ivaras Abramovich, who's CEO of it for, I guess, half a year now. He has completely replaced the leadership of Ukroboronprom, has a new nice management group, and this is mentioned as a company that has been most reformed at the top in the beginning. He has divided the companies into 3 groups: those that are in good shape, those that are in a gray zone, and those that have to be sold or closed down. So Ukroboronprom is today one of the leading lights in the reform in Ukraine. And since Ivaras Abramovich has good relationship with Zelensky people, he's likely to stay on. He has also a very close cooperation with the US advisory group led by former Secretary of the Army, Don Winter.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Roman Varshuk, which I think is in Adrian's wheelhouse, but Melinda may want to comment on. Roman was a former Canadian ambassador to Ukraine. He says, with some nostalgia about the ability to get things done by Poroshenko and Bogdan, has the West set up unrealistic ideal expectations for pro-Western players that help lead to their political demise?
I would argue that the pro-Western players or the reformers set unrealistic expectations, as did President Zelensky. And I think that there is a peril to over-promising because the Ukrainian people naively believe this kind of rhetoric. I think part of the undoing of the prime minister was that he promised 40% economic growth over the next 5 years, and then the figures began to head in the other direction. And it seems to me that Ukrainian leaders at this point, including the president, should take a more sober look at campaign rhetoric and even at their maybe native instinctual belief that they were able to accomplish certain things, and understand that governance is very hard, governance is very messy, and governance is very slow. And again, I think that we are somewhat to blame that we set up higher standards and expect Ukraine to and expand the agenda of what Ukraine should be doing. That said, judicial reform, a complete failure, and no reform in that area. There are a lot of areas where Ukraine made progress, but there wasn't sufficient understanding that it had. And I think we should be gentle also with this president. We should be kind of criticizing him when there is pullback, but if there is not rapid forward progress, I don't think we should be in kind of an attack mode. I do believe in this kind of a pragmatic space of nudging, using various institutions. But the most important thing that I worry about is that these guys have never had relationships with, quote, counterparts in the outside world who are their trusted counterparts. And I don't know how we substitute for that or help build out that kind of a relationship, because the past government did, and the past government initially, the first Yatsenyuk government had a very large group of, Western experienced reformers. They found it tough, and they sometimes gave up in dealing with the system. So I think we need to have a moderate reform agenda at this time of crisis, but make sure that there is more so no slippage rather than some dramatic bursts forward in the coming 6 months.
Melinda, I know you have a different take on this. I appreciate your views.
I largely agree with Adrian, believe it or not. But I know that we won't be boring. Don't worry. I would just say to Adrian, justice is not a lofty expectation. That was the bottom line expectation for the last 6 years. It wasn't met. I think that our language as Western observers should change right now. I think we should talk about the promise of Ukraine. And that we shouldn't bash them over the head. I agree that that's the wrong language now. But the idea, when I was listening to the question and to your explanation, I remember this phrase, this soft bigotry of low expectations. I don't want us to get caught up in having low expectations for Ukraine. Ukraine can be fabulous. It has all the potential. And I think that's the language we need to use. That's the language that I'm trying to use.
Okay, thank you, Melinda. We have a question from Basil Kalimon, who asks, who says that there seems to be some ongoing conversations between President Zelinsky and Ukrainian oligarchs, and asks if we see the influence of folks like Kolomoisky and Akhmetov and others in the government changes. We'd like to take a chance shot at that.
I'm happy to respond to that. Clearly, Rinat Akhmetov has come closer to this government and is more satisfied with it. It rather seems to me that Kolomoisky has got less importance. President Zelensky organized a meeting this Monday with 15 of the oligarchs, and they were essentially asked to help with coronavirus actions. And it's difficult to follow the different members of the cabinet, how close they are to these oligarchs. I think that it's much clearer if we look upon the parliament, who is voting for what in the parliament. That gives a better indication. John, if I may, let me also take the other question from Basil Kalimon. I read it out first. The resume of a newly appointed economy minister includes work with Enron, a US company convicted of fraud, a Russian investment company involved in money laundering, an executive of an agro company owned by an oligarch suspected of bank fraud. How is this individual supposed to merit our confidence despite his Western training? This refers to Igor Pietrashko, whom I happen to know very well and think very highly of. He's probably the strongest economic personality in the current cabinet. And here you see rather the dilemma of a US-trained MBA in Ukraine. He has also been a partner in Ernst & Young. What do you do when you climb up in Ukraine? It's pretty difficult to avoid the oligarchic companies. I would argue that Igor Pietrashko, although he's very close to Oleg Bakhmatyuk, who's now hiding abroad, that Pietrashko is an upright and reliable individual. I would trust him much more than many far more inscrutable characters, that he is likely to do the right thing. So in short, I think that we should look up on the merits and say that good Western trained professionals in Ukraine, they do not have many possibilities to avoid working for oligarchs, so therefore we should not condemn them for it.
I would politely disagree. I think that the one thing that should be done, if he is so closely linked to a major agriculture player who is corrupt, he should sever the agriculture department of his ministry, and the government should create a separate agricultural ministry, which was planned and I don't believe has yet been filled. But in the light of his many long years of service to a very dodgy agricultural figure, I think it's essential. And here I have to say that I have been working as an advisor to another less dodgy Ukrainian agricultural figure, but I'm not speaking in his behalf.
Yeah, no, on this, yeah, I agree with you, Adrian. I was just responding to him as a person.
Right, and the one point I would make about oligarchs, I mean, look, they represent a substantial portion of the employment picture. They represent a substantial portion of the economy. In a crisis mode, he has to cooperate with them. He has to create an environment where they will be cooperative. But on the other hand, he cannot allow them to to continue gaining rents. He has to prosecute them if they have violated the law, and he has to be strict about the legacy alleged criminal behavior of several of them, and that is a proper function of government. At the same time, we should understand, like Anders said, that a lot of people who have worked for these companies, some of these companies are actually run, whatever their origins were, are run reasonably openly and transparently, and have and provide employment, provide cash flow into the economy, provide hard currency earnings for the country. All those kinds of things. Just demonizing the country is also a mistake. At the same time, we should be very watchful, as Melinda is, and as Basil Kalaman, as Professor Kalaman is, in pointing out these potential conflicts of interest and try to use pressure to reduce as many of them. And here in the agricultural field, it seems to me that there is one conflict of interest that clearly should be addressed by the government with this new minister.
Melinda, I see you're eager to jump in, please.
I just wanted to finish the Kolomoisky point, and I'd love to know what Adrian thinks too. I actually disagree with Anders. I think that Kolomoisky has more influence rather than less influence, and we Ukraine observers may have gotten this wrong. I know when Zelinsky was elected, everyone was freaking out about the influence of Kolomoisky, that he'd been Zelensky's lawyer for 9 years, that they'd been business partners, et cetera, et cetera. But looking back on it, yes, they had a relationship. But Bogdan was willing to cut deals with just about everyone, is what some of our colleagues observed. Now we know that Hanshruk fell out. The prime minister fell out because Kolomoisky didn't want him there. So Kolomoisky definitely still has influence. I'd love to know more about the relationship between Yermak and Kolomoisky. That's something I just don't know. And I hope that other people are digging into that.
I don't think that the Yermak-Kolomoisky influence is the issue we should be looking at. It's the powerful influence and relationship of Mr. Avakov with Mr. Kolomoisky, and the second is of Mr. Shafir. Mr. Shafir is a person, an honorable and good person, but he has always also been a major interface with Kolomoisky in the business of the show business part of President Kolomoisky's life. My understanding is, And this is that relationship, and Shafir is a point of contact that keeps an eye on the legacy business interests of President Kolomoisky, allegedly severed, but needing to continue for the long term when President Zelensky returns to the private sector. So I think there is that phenomenon. There is now a fairly important parliamentary group that has coalesced around Kolomoisky's people, that's in alliance with other parliamentarians from other business groups and interests. And the third is that the president is still very mindful of the powerful media megaphone that 1+1 has, and that the president, oddly enough, is the only president in the last sequence, except perhaps for President Yushchenko, who has not had a media, a news media base. President Poroshenko had one and possibly two channels in the news front. President Yanukovych had Inter. President Kuchma had the Viktor Pinchuk family of television. This is a president who has no direct means megaphone without bargaining, and 1+1 is a very big part of the audience. And I think their cooperation now at a time of crisis is needed, and that's one of the reasons why I don't think Kolomoisky's influence has increased, but Kolomoisky's importance has increased, and the president seems to be fearful of addressing Kolomoisky and would prefer that Kolomoisky go away as a problem, that someone else rid me of this meddlesome priest, but not to take the action himself. And more importantly, I think he's looking for indictments in the West, criminal processes in London and in the United States. And that's why it's essential that the IMF continue the pressure to get the banking reform thing done right away.
Let me respond here.
Anders, 1 minute. Let me just make it clear regarding Mr. Kolomoisky, no one is looking for a Thomas A. Becket solution. Okay, we have a question from Bob McConnell. We haven't discussed the changes at the Ministry of Defense. So Bob asked about the impact of the new Minister of Defense on Ukraine's defense, and especially the war in the East.
John, maybe you should take that question, please.
Well, the former Minister of Defense, Mrs. Zaharanyuk, had developed a big fan club in Washington at the Pentagon. People saw him as a far-sighted visionary. People also appreciated the important contribution he made at the Minsk summit in Paris in December. So his departure was not seen as a positive. Mr. Taran has a distinguished background, or General Taran has a distinguished background, but he does not have that same reputation as a reformer who's able to take Ukraine's Ministry of Defense to a new place. Here too, I'd say there are many advisors in the Ministry of Defense. We have Americans of stature providing advice. And I would say, let's give Mr. Taran a choice, but it is unfortunate. I mean, I think Mr. Zaharanyuk is going to be missed.
By the way, Mr. Zaharanyuk did say that after the Minsk signatures, he would have resigned on principle. So we would have lost him even without the government reshuffle.
Right. Okay. We have time for one more question. I'm just going down the list to see what might be the most relevant. Okay. Melinda, this is for you. A question from Paul Nyland regarding the relationship between the new man for Veterans Affairs and the NGOs and civil activists. They'd like some more details if you have them.
So, hi, Paul. I'm glad that you could join us. To take a look at the Kyiv Post article that Oleg Sukov wrote, and I'm happy to tell you more about what I've heard. One of the leading charity organizations, Come Back Alive, which is headed by Vitaly Denega, and an organization that I trust. I really trust Vitaly. He's been doing amazing work for 6 years, has said that he simply can't work with the minister, and the minister doesn't want to work with him. So that's an issue that I'm planning to do more digging in, but I'm alarmed by just those statements alone.
All right. I think our time is just about up. We thank everyone for tuning in. There were many questions on the block regarding the Minsk negotiations and the dramatic developments last week. We did not take them because this conversation was devoted to the domestic reforms and changes in Ukraine. But we are going to do an event on Ukraine's negotiating position in the war in Donbass the week of March 30. Everyone who received an invitation to this event will receive an invitation to that. We will also be doing an event next week on the economic impact of changes in Ukraine. And Anders and others will take the lead on that discussion. And for those who want other topics, we're going to do an event next Friday on the Russian-Saudi oil war. So thank you all for tuning in. We had over 200 participants. We've kept it to 1 hour because this is a new format for us. Given how successful this is, we may go a little bit longer next time. Thank you all very much. And thank you to our panelists.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.